author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Now, we have an exciting show for you today, talking Joe Biden's disastrous poll numbers and the media abandoning ship, Top Gun Maverick, real or imaginary, what's happening with the US Navy, how can schools protect themselves from mass shootings, and why new gun laws almost always never work. I want to take a brief moment to say a special thank you to our listeners in Cadillac, Missouri on WATT, 1240 AM and 106.1 FM. Thank you for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. For President Joe Biden, the clock is ticking on his window of opportunity to pass any meaningful legacy legislation. With razor-thin congressional majorities and a fourth estate facade beginning to crack, it's time to forget about asking for whom the bell is tolling and get straight on with figuring out who the bell ringer really is. Now, we're fortunate to be joined by Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, who can pass the numbers and crack the codes with the best of them. Welcome back, Tim.
Thank you, Mark.
So, Tim, let's rip the Band-Aid off. How bad is it for Joe Biden? I mean, we're just a few short months out from the November congressionals. How bad is it? What's the diagnosis, Doctor?
Well, I would say, in a sense, all you need to say is that he's lower than Donald Trump ever was. In other words, the standard, the left always says he was the worst president in American history, Donald Trump. Of course, they did everything to make sure those poll numbers stayed low through the Russia hoax and everything else they did to try and bring him down every single day. But Biden is now lower. In fact, Mark, in half of the most recent polls, he's below 40%. In the Reuters poll, Ipsos, and nobody accuses them of being conservative.
Minus 23 points.
Minus
behind.
23. He's at 36% approval. Now, you know, the disaster awaiting at midterms for the Democrats is looking more and more ominous because this president isn't getting any more popular. And as you and I have talked about before, Mark, there's not a lot of hope that he will because he's in decline. He's not a young man who can learn a few things and recover. Or someone like Trump, who's never been in the position, doesn't know Washington, has no allies, and struggles to get things done, but he did. With Biden, he's been in Washington for 50 years. And if anything, you would have thought he would be competent, but he's not. So you've got Emerson at 38, Reuters at 36, Quinnipiac at 38. So he is underwater dramatically. And again, I don't see what he does to get out of it. If inflation goes down, that'll help. Other than that, taking steps to close the border, perhaps, opening up the spigot on fossil fuel, he's not going to do that. And we get new record gas prices every single day. This is a formula for utter disaster, especially when you consider that over 80% of the American people believe we're headed for recession.
And they might well be right. A couple of points I'd like to pick up on there, Tim. You said that Joe Biden, he's not in a position to learn new tricks. And that really strikes me because he really should be at the very pinnacle of his game. Yeah. I mean, this is a president who knows everybody in Washington, D.C. He knows everybody in the Fourth Estate. He knows everybody on K Street. He has every opportunity to succeed. And yet, whether through circumstance or his own failing abilities, he hasn't done so. And that really does bring me on to the other point. You also mentioned that they compare Joe Biden to Donald Trump and the low approval numbers that Donald Trump had. And you're absolutely right that they point out that they've been pointing out that he's still above where Donald Trump was at this point in his presidency. But of course, that's
Not
now
anymore.
in the past. But that was
not
always
anymore. So now they're just not talking about the
Yeah.
poll numbers.
But that was always a disingenuous point, wasn't it, Tim? Because Donald Trump was facing allegations that he was essentially a Russian spy, that more than half of the country and allegedly all of the Fourth Estate believed that he was a Russian asset working for Vladimir Putin. And at the same time, as you say, you had all the media pushing against him. And so that was artificially deflated numbers. But with Joe Biden, the opposite is true. People don't believe that he's a Russian agent. He might be a Chinese one. And the media is pushing his numbers up as much as possible, which brings me nicely to an article that you wrote on the page of libertynation.com about how the Fourth Estate, the media, is jettisoning its support for Joe Biden. I got to ask, why now?
Well, you know, it strikes me, Mark, that most of the people that voted in 2020 heard what they wanted to hear, what they were hoping to hear at the Biden inaugural. Unity, unity, unity. That was the theme of his inaugural. And I think people were delighted to hear that because they felt that Donald Trump was not a unifying figure. Now, since then, Joe Biden has done anything but unify. Now, if he had said in his inaugural that the threat to the nation of white supremacy and the threat to the nation of ultra MAGA was something that was going to be the focus of his presidency, then people could expect what we've seen. But he has promised one thing and delivered something entirely different. People are at a loss to understand where the leadership is. He seems to not have his hand on the tiller, and there's no guidance, there's no direction, and how he recovers from that, I don't know. He's going to have a change of chief of staff. Ron Klain will be out soon enough. But I think you know, as I concluded that article about how the elite media is finally can't turn away from the fact that this presidency is the Titanic. They can't turn away from it. They can try to make it look as good as possible. The left can say, oh, well, he got infrastructure, and look, we only have 4% unemployment, but you can put a bonnet on a warthog, but it's still a warthog.
Yeah, I expected the media to act a little bit more like degenerate gamblers, as it were, you know, that they make a bet, they lose, they keep putting money down, and they get the mindset that we've invested so much in this proposition. But as you point out, they are starting to distance themselves from it, whether that's by not talking or just by acknowledging that things are not as rosy as they once promised. Now, let's talk very, very briefly about that unity question, that unifying force. Is it possible that a chief executive, commander-in-chief, can't actually bring unity to the nation if they have policy goals that are in themselves divisive?
Well, he was elected like George W. Bush, but he's trying to govern like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And what I mean is, there was no mandate for him to do anything other than not be Donald Trump. That was the only mandate he got. And yet, with his Build Back Better and all these socialist schemes, which we barely were able to brush aside thanks to Joe Manchin, FDR came into office with a striking mandate to do something like the New Deal. Joe Biden came in basically to sort of calm things down, make people feel that things had returned to what he was calling normal, where there wasn't a crisis every single day. He's tried to act like he got this overwhelming mandate to turn the United States from a constitutional republic into a social democracy. That's not what people voted for. That's not what they want. And he's not even good at trying to do what he's trying to do.
Those who crave power will always hear what they want to hear. Tim Donner, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Coming up later in the show, we talk reflexive gun laws and their inevitable failure. But next up, after this short break, we examine Top Gun Maverick and how realistic US air superiority really is. We'll be right back. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
With the release of Maverick, the new Top Gun movie, a lot of questions abound about whether the US Navy is still the superior fighting force in the world. Well, we're very lucky to be joined by not only defense expert Dave Patterson, but Dave is also a retired Air Force pilot, so brings something quite unique to the table. Dave, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
Now, I know we don't normally talk movies. We're usually talking defense, world geopolitics, and Biden's back and forth on the world stage. But I do have to ask, Dave, with the release of this movie, there's a lot of renewed interest in what's happening with the fighter jets, the F-14s, the F-18s. And I think what everybody wants to know is, does the U.S. still have air superiority?
The short answer is yes. And air superiority is kind of a vague term. But nonetheless, we have the finest air combat capability in the world. I
think it's important to figure out what everybody else kind of has. So in the movie Maverick, which I haven't seen yet, but will be shortly, there's a lot of talk of an unnamed enemy and that their capabilities are almost matching those of America. Now, how close are other countries in terms of fighter jets, fighter pilots, and air cover?
Well, I think that China, Russia, and they're the principal threats that we face, and their capability is formidable. There's no question about that. But the biggest thing that we have to our advantage is that we have the finest training there is to be, and we also have a very formidable capability in that we look at war in terms of combined arms. It's just not one fighter pilot out there doing his business, but we have the entire force that is focused on the threat and how to eliminate it.
So Top Gun, the movie, was about that training program or that process of training troops, pilots. And you say that America has the top training program in the world. What's the difference then? Why aren't China and Russia adopting a similar training program?
I don't know that they're not trying to do that, but the fact is that our emphasis on the right things at the right time, we bring up our pilots in early pilot training programs that are very intense and cover a great deal of situations where they'll find themselves. We train them to be thoughtful and to be unique and innovative, and that's one thing I don't think that China and Russia do. They have very top-down command and control, but our training programs are just second to none. And with new capabilities coming on, particularly for the Air Force with the new trainer, the T-7 Red Tail, I think that we're just quite excellent in the way in which we train our pilots.
Well, that actually brings me on to two further questions, Dave. So there's a lot of talk in the movie about unmanned fighter jets. Now, you talk about how because the US doesn't have a very top-down command structure in this, and that the pilots are taught to be individuals and unique, and to very much think by the seat of their flight suits. Is that something that would be lost with unmanned fighter jets? And can unmanned fighter jets ever really compete in war against manned fighter jets?
Well, you're talking to a pilot. So I see the unmanned and aerial vehicles more like targets as opposed to capability. But eventually, I mean, this kind of a weapon system is going to come into its own with the artificial intelligence that's being developed. It certainly is going to be something that we're going to see in the very near future, I believe. But nonetheless, I think that the argument is between autonomous unmanned vehicles, which go about their business on their own, and those that are controlled in some sort of a formation by a mothership, if you will.
So we've seen a progression go from the F-14 to the F-18. Now, you brought up a new plane, new fighter jet just now. What is that?
It's a trainer. It's the T-7A. It's going to replace the T-38.
And what makes that so special?
Well, it's new. It has a much more integrated avionics system. It is basically the avionics and mission systems that a pilot will see when they transition into a fighter. Flat screens, very modern and state-of-the-art kinds of mission systems and avionics.
And does it come included with Animal Crossing?
Yes, it does. It does, absolutely. And with really good brakes, so that, if the animal does surprise them, like on the highway, not a problem.
That'll work. I mean, it's going to compete with the new Tesla eventually. So, Dave, how much of the Top Gun movie, the original Top Gun movie that you and I have both seen, how realistic was that when reality meets the road rubber of fiction?
Not particularly, particularly with modern warfare. I mean, there may be those rare occasions when a fighter will actually engage another in what we would consider a dogfight. But the fact is that with our long-range missiles, and if you're in a dogfight, something has happened that you had not anticipated. And it's one of the reasons why I believe that the Navy in the F-35C model of their F-35, they have a pod for a gun, and as opposed to an internally mounted gun. And I think that's because they don't anticipate engaging the enemy close in as much as they would at distances. You want to be able to kill the enemy at 100 miles. You don't want to have to see the whites of their eyes. And I think that's becoming more and more the goal of our combat aircraft.
So, Dave, final question for you. How do you think this movie will impact U.S. Navy reputation?
Oh, I think that it will, more than anything else, it'll help the Navy in their pilot recruitment. During, Top Gun 1, at many theaters, the Navy had recruiting booths in the lobby of the theater. But I have to remind everyone, when they talk about the Tactical Air Command and fighter pilots, there was never a movie in the Air Force called the Tactical Air Command. There was a movie with Jimmy Stewart called the Strategic Air Command.
Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark. Always happy to be with you.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the country on the Radio American Network. I'd like to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Cadillac, Missouri on WATT, 1240 AM and 106.1 FM. Thank you for being here. Coming up later in the show, we talk how gun laws imposed after a tragedy never really work. But up next, we're asking how schools can actually protect themselves. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
In the wake of the Uvalde, Texas shooting, politicians are going full throttle to increase control over firearms. But is this perhaps focusing on the wrong aspect? And why has talk of armed teachers and school security measures been entirely ignored? Well, someone who's looked at the numbers on this is Liberty Nation's Jeff Charles, who joins us today. Welcome back, Jeff. Good to have you here.
Yeah, glad to be back.
So, Jeff, give me the broad strokes version. What actually works in terms of school security?
Well, we can look at a variety of different situations and different types of government buildings. I mean, you have schools in the inner cities, you have courthouses, you have city council buildings, other types of government buildings. And when was the last time that you heard about a mass shooting in any of these areas? It doesn't happen very often.
No.
Even if somebody does get a little crazy, they're taken care of pretty quick because they have these security measures to protect the people inside. So we're talking things like metal detectors, armed security that's already on campus, not waiting to respond after something happens. Not just one officer. You have maybe 3 to 5 armed agents there to prevent a shooting or to minimize the damage from that. You might have surveillance cameras, and people have talked about points of entry. I don't know much about that part, but there are a lot of different security measures that we could be employing that would help to even stop these in the first place, or minimize the damage just in case somebody does try to victimize children.
Well, I think what everybody really wants to know, Jeff, is how do we know for sure that these things would actually work?
Yeah, it's like I said before. When was the last time you saw somebody go into a courthouse and take out 5, 6, 7 people? Or members of your city council? People hate politicians, right? So have you heard about anybody going in there with a gun and,
now, people have been in there with their harsh words and then had the DOJ set on them, of course, by Attorney General Merrick Garland, but slightly different situation. So why do you think the politicos here, they're not really willing to engage with these ideas specifically? Now, is it because these ideas, metal detectors, armed security, points of entry and exit, is it because they don't specifically deal with guns and therefore they don't get the headlines that other such legislation or regulation would?
I think there's a lot to it. I mean, I think when we're talking about the politicos and even everyday people, about 70% of these people pushing gun control don't know much about guns or about the issue itself. I think that a lot of people don't like the idea of our schools having armed security because it looks like it's a prison or militarized, although we don't make those same complaints with courthouses and other buildings. When it comes to the politicos, yes, I think that is precisely the reason why they're pushing back against security measures, because their ultimate goal is to have fewer Americans who are armed, even if that doesn't really fix the problem or even save any lives.
Yeah, you and I have spoken about this next topic before, Jeff, at length in some cases. And it seems that homeschooling is obviously on a massive rise in the US and worldwide at the moment. Now, do you think that some of those parents who are concerned about school shooters might be gravitating more towards the idea of educating their kids at home in a safe environment? Now, is that a sound theory?
Mark, I'm already hearing about it. I'm already seeing people talking about homeschooling. Now, a lot of these people were probably thinking about homeschooling in the first place, but this type of event can push somebody over the edge, especially when these things become so politicized that no solutions are implemented. So parents are seeing this. They see that this has been happening for 2 decades and not much has been done to stop these shootings. If you're already thinking about homeschooling, this is the type of thing that would actually push you to do it.
Yeah, it's very much a catalyst, I think. Do you think that part of it is because they've seen laws enacted after previous school shootings and they failed to actually stop school shootings taking place? And in many cases, which I'll be talking about with Scott Cosenza later on in this show, where the laws that were implemented as a knee-jerk reaction, they didn't really address the specific crimes that were committed, which led to the school shootings. So do you think part of it is because the parents, they're aware that any laws that are being enacted here are knee-jerk reactions rather than solid solutions to protecting children?
I think so, Mark. I think the bottom line is, a lot of parents aren't even paying attention to the legislation and things like that. Some are, some aren't. But the bottom line, all parents know is that this stuff keeps happening. And that's all they need to know. The problem hasn't been solved. We haven't decreased the number of school shootings. We don't even have a plan for mental health or anything else. All the issues that we talk about that lead up to these shootings, it's just talk, and everybody knows it. So people are probably even expecting for it to happen again, unfortunately, because we always have a conversation, but they're always the wrong conversations that don't lead to any solutions. And that's all anybody needs to know. If it keeps happening, that's all they need to know.
So what are the right conversations, Jeff?
I would say it goes back to what I was saying before. Why shouldn't our children enjoy the same protection that our politicians do, that our judges, that our officials? Why should they not have the same level of protection? I could take people on the gun control side a little bit more seriously if they were willing to consider those options while still pushing for their anti-gun stuff that I would disagree with, but they don't. They push back against things that have already been proven to work because their agenda is something different than safeguarding these kids' lives.
Yeah, and of course, many of the politicians calling for a reduction in firearm ownership are protected by armed employees almost 24 hours a day in some cases, in many cases. Now, with most things political, it does tend to come down to a cost-benefit ratio. Now, is there, I presume there is, but there's some benefit to politicians aiming for measures that they know won't pass in Congress. As we've seen at the moment, obviously there's a very 50-50 divide pretty much on what kind of gun control implementations, or whether to implement any gun control measures at all. But they kind of know that these things, that they're not going to pass with 60 votes. They're not going to break the filibuster on this. But do they see it as, at least they will have been able to explain to the public that, look, we tried to do this, and it's their fault that we failed to do this. Therefore, the answer is more of us and less of them. Is that really the angle they're taking on this?
I think both sides are doing that, Mark. I think Democrats in particular, Schumer already said he's going to be holding the vote. Yeah, Senator John Cornyn is going to be meeting with Chris Murphy, Republican and Democrat, to find out a solution to gun violence. And they're not going to come to any agreement. So what Chuck Schumer is going to do is he's going to get people on record voting against whatever the Democrats come up with, hoping that the American public will view Republicans less favorably. Republicans are going to say, hey, we tried to work with them, but what they wanted was way too radical and not practical. So it's going to be interesting to see who wins that messaging battle. Right now, polling shows that most of the country wants stricter gun laws, but that margin is very small, and it's been closing rapidly over the past 4 years. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, and just to come back on that, Jeff, I think when we see the polls that say most people favor certain gun laws, it's certainly not what the Democrats are proposing at the moment. That would, I think, be far and away too much for the majority of the nation in terms of what they're asking for. Well, Jeff Charles, we will absolutely come back and revisit this at some point. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Now, don't go anywhere. Coming up after this short break, we're back with Scott DeCasenza discussing the laws that were put in place after shootings and if they worked or not. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Calls for remaking America's gun laws come fast and furious after the shootings in Texas and Buffalo. But will these proposed laws actually do any good for anyone? Well, perhaps a look at the history and the laws that did make it through Congress can provide a clue. Well, we're joined by Scott DeCasenza Esquire, lawyer, host of the Uprising podcast, and general man about town, who has dug deep into such laws and is here to enlighten us. Welcome back, Scott.
Thank you, Mark. A pleasure.
So, Scott, you've looked into the laws passed in reaction to school shooting throughout the years, and whether they would have actually worked to prevent that particular crime. Now, I suspect that we all know what the answer is going to be here, but give me a breakdown of your top two favorites.
Well, federal firearms regulation has followed this, this pattern. That perhaps the most impactful regulation is the Firearms Act of 1968, which was proposed in the wake of John F. Kennedy's assassination, and then passed in the wake of his brother's assassination and Martin Luther King's assassination. King and Bobby were both shot with domestically produced firearms, a Remington rifle and a Iver Johnson handgun. In those cases, JFK was shot with a rifle that was imported and sold via mail order. And so that subjected to multiple potential opportunities for federal legislation. At the time, they didn't think they could just legislate, banning of guns. So they took the basically that it had traveled in interstate commerce, and that was able for them to ban mail order rifles. But Oswald could have bought that rifle or a different rifle that would be, in fact, of increased functionality locally. He just chose that for the same reason that people choose to buy imports of anything from cars to shoes, that the different variety and often cheaper prices. So that wouldn't have made a difference. The assault weapons ban of 1994 is perhaps the next biggest one.
That is probably the most famous one, especially in the light of recent things with Joe Biden saying that
It's most famously known, but it's not actually most impactful in actually how guns are sold in commerce, both at the wholesale and the retail level. That would be the 1968 law.
Yeah,
but
and I believe we're going to get into it wasn't that effective in terms of its effect either.
Well, yeah, of course. No, look, guns are ubiquitous, and the other thing, Mark, anything that we discuss has to be, I think, couched with the mind towards, if we're not actually going to try to address why these shooters do their shootings and the hateful mind and, if you want to say, soul that they have, what's going to happen when in a very few short years we have printable guns that are completely unable to be controlled by the government? That's where we're headed. We're almost there with 3D printed guns, and it's only a matter of a few years before these are a reality. And so all these things that we're talking about just kind of don't matter when it comes to these regulations, because it won't be whether or not a person can get a gun. It will be, can they get their hands on a printer that's capable of making a gun? And for people with some money to burn, that's almost certainly going to be a yes.
Scott, but I think it's worth pointing out that there's no mention in the Constitution of people being allowed 3D printers. So
yeah, I suppose you're right. Well, we'll see about that one.
So let's get back to this 1994 assault weapons ban.
And that was passed in the wake of a few tragedies, including the Stockton schoolyard massacre, kind of were the impetus of that. And I think it's helpful for people who aren't in the gun culture to argue by analogy. And just if for instance, I may have even discussed this before on LN Radio, which is if we use like sports cars and we say, oh, sports cars are a real problem with people speeding up and down the road, so we're going to ban the Chevy Corvette. And they say, okay, the Corvette is now called the X-Speeder car. Well, if you ban these things by name, which is what the assault weapons ban of 1994 did, it banned a number of firearms by name. And you can imagine the day after the ban was placed, the manufacturers just said, this is no longer an AR-15, it's an AR-15 plus one, right? And then
they're calling in the madmen to do the advertising, right?
And the other thing that it did was, effectively drive up the prices of many of these things. So, for instance, it also banned the production of full-size ammunition magazines, those that can hold more than 10 rounds. But it didn't ban the possession of those that held more than 10 rounds, Mark. It just banned the manufacture. So all those who had existing stock and inventory, they basically just got a free gift from the government that their property was now worth more because supply and demand.
It was the Bitcoin of 1994.
Well, not quite, but yeah. So again, all that does is prevent somebody who doesn't have $100 from buying a magazine, rather than the true cost, which would have been $15 or $20. Without the ban in place.
Now,
so
Scott,
again,
I know you don't like to do theoreticals here, Scott, but is it possible that somebody who was looking to acquire a higher capacity magazine for criminal purpose would be adverse to stealing that money to buy the higher capacity magazine?
Not only that, we don't have any notion that they would need to. And what I mean by that is that, for instance, the murderer of Uvalde, Texas, he didn't just buy an AR-15. He bought what would be like the BMW of AR-15s, Mark, a couple $1,000s worth. So it's not even the case that the need to scrape the bottom of the barrel cost-wise. That's sort of more indicative of what we see cheap guns in maybe fueling violence in like Chicago and Philly, the kind of like teenagers, urban teenagers who don't have that kind of dough. But I don't know where this kid got his money from, but he obviously had plenty to buy a really nice AR-15, and one that, increasing the cost by some small measure would not have made a difference.
Okay, so obviously we've looked at these two specific instances, but obviously in your research you've looked at many more. And have you found instances where gun laws passed in the wake of a specific tragedy would have prevented that tragedy? Or is it by and large a case that they're completely missing the mark every time?
Well, they're missing the mark every time, and here's why. Even if the law itself would have prevented that specific mechanism by which the shooter bought or acquired their firearm. It would only have prevented it if you then would say that they would have stopped there and wouldn't have taken ordinary means to accomplish their goal otherwise. So if, for instance, we ban high capacity or full capacity magazines from being sold at the store, okay, would that have stopped somebody who bought a full capacity magazine at the store? Well, no, if they just simply would have gone on and bought one at a gun show or at on a classified ad or from eBay or any of the other legal ways they could have. So you'd have to literally take it out of the hands of all those possessors in order to prevent somebody from having it, for instance. You couldn't just ban production. The numbers that are already produced are so high, Mark, that all it will do is produce some price inflation, but availability will always be there.
I think a lot of people get hung up on the fact that this is guns, specifically politicians, whereas we know murder is possible not just with guns, but with, as we've seen here in Europe from 2015 onwards, people carrying out deadly attacks with vehicles. Most notably in France, in Nice, I believe that was.
You've got a real knife crime issue over there in the UK that we don't have.
Huge knife crime issue in the UK, specifically London, the big cities. And then,
much
of course,
like the US with our gun murders, by the way.
And then, of course, in China, where guns are very few and far between, you have people going into schools and stabbing children on rampages, and this is becoming more and more ubiquitous, and it's an issue. But the issue in these countries, France with trucks, the UK with knives, China with stabbing implements in schools, the issue is not the guns, it's people.
It is people, and without fixing the people, I don't know what you can do. There's a very natural kind of, I think, reaction when one confronts this level of heinous madness to do something. And that's a reaction we can all have and forgive in others. But to base public policy on just an emotional reaction to this without thinking it through and how it's going to affect people and will it yield a positive result or a negative one, I think is irresponsible. And one of the things we don't see on any of these is any ledger balance on the other side of the equation. You know, a fantastically high number of children die each year by drowning in backyard swimming pools in America. It's a real tragedy. Is the answer then to, fill up with concrete every backyard swimming pool? It would certainly save, many families horrible tragedies. But we vote with, no, we have the freedom to do these things. And people, there's a certain amount of risk out there. And I would say that with respect to firearms, these guns are used as tools and for self-defense and for protecting our liberty. And it's tough to say that in the face of a schoolroom full of dead fourth graders, but it does need to be said, Mark.
And with that, Scott DeCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
And we're almost done for this episode of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Tim Donner, Dave Patterson, Jeff Charles, and Scott DeCosenza, and of course you, the listeners, for being here with us. My final thoughts for this week. When politicians propose solutions that will likely as not either impact your rights or your wallet, they must be certain that their intended actions will have the desired outcome. As we've seen with almost every gun control measure so far, this has not been the case. And that begs a question. Why are politicians not held accountable for failed laws? Sure, voters can go to the ballot box, but without knowing that the legislation was an expensive failure, the voters can't be informed voters. A brave politician would outline precisely what factors would mean their legislation has failed before even putting it up to Congress. That way, the people would know for sure whether the law was a success or not. But as I say, that would require bravery. And that seems to be in very short supply in the corridors of power. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
Daily tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. gone.